Good evening, and welcome to the John F. Kennedy Jr. Forum at the Institute of Politics. My name is Christopher Bolge, and I'm a sophomore here at the college studying government, and a member of the John F. Kennedy Jr. Forum Committee. Before we begin, please take a moment to note the exit doors, both on the Park side and the JFK Street side. In the event of emergency, exit the door nearest to you and congregate in JFK Park. Before we begin, please also take a moment to silence your cell phones and join me in welcoming Harvard College undergraduate Peter Jones.
Hello all, and welcome to this evening's John F. Kennedy Jr. Forum at the Institute of Politics. My name is Peter Jones, and I'm a senior in the college studying government and Spanish literature, and like Chris, I'm a member of the student-led John F. Kennedy Jr. Forum Committee. It's my honor tonight to introduce Jake Sullivan and Graham Allison for a discussion on America's role in the world and the role of national security today. Their conversation will touch on regional focuses including the Middle East, Russia and Ukraine, and China, among others. Jake Sullivan served as the U.S. National Security Advisor under President Joe Biden from 2021 to 2025. In this role, he played a pivotal part in shaping U.S. foreign policy, addressing major global challenges such as the Russian invasion of Ukraine, the Israel-Hamas conflict, and strategic competition with China. Sullivan coordinated international efforts to support Ukraine and helped maintain and strengthen the NATO alliance. Sullivan was also deeply involved in efforts to expand normalization between Israel and Arab states and efforts to counterbalance Chinese technological competition. Sullivan worked to fortify U.S. alliances that today seem to feel under more stress than previously, including strengthening ties with Japan and Australia through the Quad, and investing in the U.S., UK, Australia Security Pact, better known as AUKUS. Additionally, in April 2025, Sullivan joined us here at the Harvard Kennedy School as the inaugural Kissinger Professor of Statecraft and World Order. Joining Sullivan in the forum tonight is Professor Graham Allison, the Douglas Dillon Professor of Government here at Harvard, where he has taught for over 5 decades. A leading expert on national security and international affairs, Allison is renowned for his analysis of nuclear strategy, U.S.-China relations, and decision-making in government. Many consider Allison the founding dean of the modern Kennedy School, transforming it into a premier institution for public policy and leadership education. Additionally, as Assistant Secretary of Defense in the first Clinton administration, Allison received the Defense Medal for Distinguished Public Service for his efforts to help reduce the former Soviet nuclear arsenal. We are so lucky to have the company of these two savvy practitioners for our discussion this evening. Please join me in welcoming Jake Sullivan and Graham Allison.
So good evening, and a special word of welcome to the inaugural Henry A. Kissinger Professor of Statecraft and World Order. Jake just finished 85 days ago 4 years of the most intense role in the U.S. government as the National Security Advisor, and before that, and before that, and before that. But if you just try to think about what every one of those days is like, and one of the most successful in the history of America's national security advisors. So he could have gone anywhere and done anything. And the fact that he decided to come to the Harvard and the Kennedy School to teach, to write a book, to engage with colleagues is an extraordinary vote of confidence in the school and a signature item for our dean. So I would just say, welcome to Jake again.
I also couldn't say no to Graham and Megan, so, it's kind of a no-brainer.
It was said that Megan O'Sullivan, the director of the Belfer Center, and I were like 2 parts of a tag team wrestling match, so that when one got exhausted, the other one could come in and keep working on the problem. So Harvard has a long history with national security advisors. The dean of the college, McGeorge Bundy, was JFK's national security advisor. Henry Kissinger was Nixon's national security advisor. Spig Brzezinski was Carter's national security advisor. So the national security advisor is a crucial position in American national security. Actually, Henry, in his comments on the topic, says the national security advisor, this is his modest description of it. The national security advisor is the top position in government in terms of interests. Every president since Kennedy has trusted the national security advisor more than the members of his cabinet. And crucial to the success of the national security advisor is there's the president's confidence in him. So Jake, describe for us a day in the life of a national security advisor. What time does it start? What time does it end? What happens, a typical day if there was ever such a thing?
Well, it starts at 12:01 a.m. and it ends at 11:59 p.m., I guess. You know, every national security advisor, I think, likes to come before crowds and say their time in the seat was the most complex, pressure-filled, challenging time for any national security advisor in history. But in my case, it was actually true. So, and, you know, I do think, actually, I occupied the chair over 4 years during a time of unique change and transition in the world, where there was crisis, there was turbulence, there were tectonic shifts in geopolitical competition, there was an accelerating AI revolution, a growing climate crisis. We were coming out of the COVID-19 pandemic, and so much else. And that meant that you were always on the clock. So at my house in DC, I had a SCIF, a secure facility, so that if I got a call at 1, 2, 3 o'clock in the morning, I could go down there and take it on a secure line. You know, there were things happening around the world. Someone was always awake, and someone was always doing something to disrupt the world. So it was nonstop and constant. And to me, the key thing was managing the inbox, all the things coming at us, without losing sight of the fact that we were trying to achieve some things too. We were trying to make investments in American power. We were trying to reinforce America's allies. We were trying to address major challenges like climate change and put guardrails around the risks of artificial intelligence. And every single day I had to remind myself, at least a few times a day, don't just do what's coming at you. Shape the world, don't just react to the world. And that's probably the single hardest thing about being National Security Advisor.
I think if, for those that want to read White House Years, Henry Kissinger's book, he would give us extremely similar description of how if you just do your inbox, you can't get through the day. So if you don't focus on the few things that you really care about and carve out some time for them in spite of the rest. So let's imagine students here want to grow up to be like Jake. So how could a nice young man who grew up in Minnesota, I mean, Jake, as far as I know, there's only one black mark on Jake's resume. That's he went to Yale. I can't quite get over that, but I think that I realize that happened. Other than that, so tell us a little bit, what are some clues for somebody that wants to be like Jake in this country or in another country, to be National Security Advisor or some analogous?
Well, I'd say a couple things. One's a piece of career advice. Well, two are pieces of career advice, and one is just kind of a general way of operating in the world that I think can help prepare you for positions of consequence, whether it's in government or in foundations or in NGOs or in the private sector. First piece of career advice is don't be so fixed on a certain path that you aren't open to taking opportunities that come your way. So I finished law school. I clerked for Justice Breyer, a distinguished Harvard graduate. And I moved home to Minnesota, thinking that I was going to make a life more rooted in the community, more local, and focused on the law. Amy Klobuchar called me up in 2006, right after she was elected to the Senate, and said, hey, would you come out and help me get started in Washington? Just come out for 3 months. I talked to the law firm I was at the time. I said, I'm just going to take a leave for 3 months and I'll be back. Left all my stuff in my office. That was in December of 2006, and I'm not sure if they've ever moved the stuff out of that office or not, because I never ended up going back. One thing led to another, and I got opportunities. And that leads to my second piece of general career advice, which is find mentors. When you're judging a class, a job, an internship, an extracurricular pursuit, I would say the number one thing you should ask yourself is there someone there who can teach me and someone there who will be my champion later. That's more important than the prestige of the outfit or the particular substance of the job. Finding good mentors makes all the difference in the world. I ended up working for Hillary Clinton because Les Gelb, who I worked for at the Council on Foreign Relations as an intern, called me up one day, and I was planning to finally make my way back to Minnesota after being with Amy for a while. He said, "Hey, would you like to do debate prep for Hillary Clinton in 2008? I said, "Yeah, sure." And that was all because Les had invested in me and believed in me. And then the one piece of advice that I would give everybody is you have to have a deep conviction, a worldview, things, principles that ground you and motivate you. But you also have to be able to change your mind about particular opinions you hold or perspectives that you have. If you get new information, if you hear a good argument, and at least a few times a week you're not saying, I've learned something, and what I thought before, I think differently now, you're doing something wrong. And that's true while you're at school, for sure, but it's true throughout your career. And I found the people who were most effective in government were the people who held true to their core convictions, but also were able to adjust their opinions when they were faced with new evidence and new information. And over the course of my career, the world has changed. And so my perspective on the world has changed. And I think that that is an incredibly important value and ethos to hold. It is not a sign of weakness to say I changed my mind, I was wrong. It's a sign of strength, intellectual strength, emotional strength. And I would really just encourage everybody to recognize that. Any argument you make will have weaknesses and blind spots, and you should acknowledge them. And the people making the opposite argument probably have some good points, and you should acknowledge those too. And I think that's just a mode of operating in the world that whether you end up as National Security Advisor or something more pleasant, it's a good way to operate.
So great career advice. Say a little bit more about your path has taken you into politics as well as policy. He also is married to the congresswoman from New Hampshire. So politics is in the blood. And actually, at one stage, I was thinking you were going to go back to Minnesota and run for Congress. I was eager to support you in that role. So many Kennedy School students like to imagine they could be the prince, whisper into the ear of the prince as they've worked out their details, like Machiavelli did. But tell us a little bit about in your story, because I think you've actually talked about this before.
Yeah.
Now, if you're not interested in politics, you're probably not going to be fit for high office in policy in the American system.
Yeah. So first, I want to acknowledge my mother-in-law, Betty Tamposi, who's here, and I'm very nervous because I have to perform in front of my mother-in-law, Maggie's mom.
She's also a Kennedy School graduate.
Kennedy School graduate, yes. So she has that over on me. I am now thinking about running potentially for the head of the Congressional Spouses Club. So I may be seeking people's support for that as we go forward. Look, there are a lot of people here from other systems, other governments, other countries. The American system is in a way unique because there is a turnover of the top level, the cabinet secretaries, the principal advisors. They're not all drawn from either the career service or from elected, members of parliament. They are senior people who come in as political appointees of the President of the United States. And you know, hard questions related to national security, whether it's to do with US-China, supporting Ukraine, dealing with the clean energy transition, dealing with the technology revolution, all of them are shot through with politics. There is no avoiding that. No policy can effectively be sustained. This is something I learned from President Biden, without the informed consent of the American people. And if the American people aren't going to stand behind something, over time, that policy is not going to be effectively sustainable. No policy can be pursued without resources, and resources come from the horse trading of Congress choosing to pass budgets or not pass budgets. And you know, I saw this in living color as we were trying to get this supplemental funding for Ukraine through in 2024. And the delay in that funding made a major difference in terms of Ukraine's position on the battlefield, their access to basic munitions. And yet the answer to why we weren't able to get it done was very simple, one word: politics. And so I think to be truly effective as a policymaker, you don't need necessarily to be a pure political animal by any stretch of the imagination, but you have to understand the context within which you are making policy decisions. What are the opportunities presented by politics? What are the constraints imposed by politics? And you also have to remember that the person sitting in the Oval Office had to go out and get at least 270 electoral votes. And that's why they're in their job and you're in your job, not the person who got those 270 electoral votes. And ultimately, they have the authority and you are serving them. And that's another thing that President Biden would occasionally remind us of as well, particularly me when I would stick with a disagreement for too long. But you know, I have at various points in my career thought about running for office. And you know, the reason I haven't gone down that path to date has largely been because of the opportunities that I've been afforded in appointed office, which I have found incredibly consequential and honorable. You know, last year when Congresswoman Annie Kuster decided not to run for re-election in New Hampshire, I was the first person to walk out, I saw it on the news, called Maggie, said, "You got to go up and do this." She did it, and it requires, I will tell you, a bravery and fearlessness that is quite exceptional, and I got to see it firsthand and watch her go and win and now serve as a first-term member of Congress.
Okay, one of the founding fathers of the Kennedy Show, Dick Neustadt, who wrote the great book on presidential power, one of his sort of dictums was that if you can't imagine yourself running for office, you're in a democratic system, you're going to work for somebody who did, and you're going to be handicapped in trying to understand why their perspectives are different from yours. So that doesn't mean you have to do it. And Lyndon Johnson had this good line after he had inherited Kennedy's advisor, his national security advisor, Bundy, his Secretary of Defense, McNamara, and they would tell him, you know, you should do this, you should do that. And he said, you know, I would feel much better with all of you if one of you had just once run for sheriff.
Yeah. You know, President Biden he never quite said sheriff, but he when he was a senator, he actually asked every member of his staff, even if they were there to work on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, to go to his constituent office in Delaware and actually deal directly with the constituents, deal with their needs, their problems, answer their questions. It wasn't exactly the same thing as actually standing for office, but his view was that if you are not directly engaging with the people who you are purporting to serve in your role in appointed office, then you have a certain limitation on your perspective. And I will say, there are all kinds of strict rules about what a national security advisor could do as a candidate spouse. Last summer, like, I could be at a fundraiser, but I couldn't prepare food for a fundraiser, which worked well for me because I can't really prepare food, but that was in the memo. But I could be there. I could go to events and watch.
You could clap.
Maggie. I could clap as a supportive husband, but not as a political statement. So literally, these were the kinds of distinctions that existed. So, you know, I would stand there kind of thinking, how do I clap? How do I stand? You know? But I did get to see Maggie in small towns in northern New Hampshire talk to people about the cost of housing, but also about events in the world. And frankly, it was a good reminder that you can get hermetically sealed into the West Wing of the White House and miss that at the end of the day, you are there to serve the people, and the people have a perspective that you should damn well listen to. And so even if people choose not to run for office, if you were going to work in government, finding ways to break out of that hermetic seal and get out and hear directly from constituents, from those you are serving. I will tell you, there is no substitute for that, and one should have the discipline of that practice throughout one's service in government.
Good advice for all of us. So one of the things Jake's going to do over the next year, or maybe a little longer, is write a book about...
Thank you for saying maybe a little longer.
Well, you said in a year. I think you'll probably do it in a year. It drives me crazy because it takes me about 8 years, but in any case. So it's too early to actually have perspective on the 4 years of the Biden administration's national security policy. But as you just begin to think about it, what would be 1 or 2 examples of the things of which you're most proud? And what would be 1 or 2 examples of the things that you wish you could do over?
Yeah. So one thing that I am very proud to have been able to do was play a central role in the management of the competition with China at an incredibly consequential, even decisive moment in that competition, and to manage it in a way where I think we improved America's strategic position, reinforced a common approach with our allies, invested in the sources of our strength, and protected our technology so that it couldn't be used against us. But at the same time, we managed that competition without it tipping over into conflict, preserving lines of communication, expanding those lines of communication, and also creating the space where we could work together with China on consequential issues where the US and China simply must work together. And I think that's a mouthful. That's not a policy that can be subject to a bumper sticker, but I think it's that kind of stewardship that I think makes all the difference on one of the most consequential geopolitical issues of our time. And one of the things that allowed me to play that role was the many, many, many hours I spent with Wang Yi, who is the Politburo member and responsible for national security as well as the foreign minister. We met in multiple cities all over the world for a couple days at a time, dozens of hours in total. And we had real conversations about how to manage this relationship. And they weren't happy talk or BS. They were substantive. They were serious. They were occasionally contentious, not in the sense of we raised our voices, but in the sense we disagreed. And so I'm quite proud of that. And I think the ripple effects of that, if that policy were sustained, would be quite traumatic for America's economic competitiveness and national security. I have my concerns as we approach 100 days in about the erosion of some of the core advantages America has in that competition based on actions this administration has taken, but I'm quite proud of that. I'm very proud of what we did to stand up to defend Ukraine against Russian aggression. We have critics on one side who say we just let the war go on too long and we should have pulled the plug and called it a day, and some of those critics now occupy positions in the current administration. We have critics on the other side who say we didn't give enough fast enough. But what I think those two criticisms miss is the basic big picture, which is that the United States rallied a coalition of nations to help Ukraine withstand an onslaught from a massive army pouring across its border. Ukraine stands as a free and independent nation. Russia will not conquer Kyiv, and it will not conquer Ukraine. Russia has suffered grievously, and the suffering economically and otherwise is compounding, and the United States did not have to send a single American man or woman to fight and die in that war. I think that is, and through it all, we did not end up tipping over into superpower conflict between the United States and Russia. I think if you had said at the outset we could produce a handoff to the new administration with those pieces in place and with growing leverage for a negotiated peace that would be just and sustainable for Ukraine, If you had said that 2.5 years ago when the tanks started rolling, you'd say, that's something to be proud of, and I am proud of it. You know, something that I would like to have over, obviously, were the series of events, immediate events that led up to the withdrawal from Afghanistan. And I've talked about the choice that we made to defer the evacuation because the Afghan government was imploring us not to set in motion a series of events that would cause a collapse. Well, that collapse ended up happening. So in hindsight, we should have moved earlier. But I will say, I think President Biden, at a fundamental level, made the right call to end the war in Afghanistan. If I were sitting on this stage today and we were still at war in Afghanistan, that war would be entering its 25th year of Americans fighting and dying in Afghanistan. So I think the call was right. The execution is something that we could learn lessons from and did learn lessons from, which we applied over the remainder of our time in office.
In the Ukraine piece for a second, so early on in the war, and then you described the 3 or 4 objectives that we had, President Biden, I think maybe even the first month in the war, said, we're not going to fight World War III for Ukraine. So this is a war that's therefore fought under the shadow, in effect, of a sword of Damocles in the hand of Putin. So where did that come from? Yes, that statement as a part of our objectives and also a constraint on the various things that we were doing.
You know, it's interesting. A lot of national security decision-making, a lot of foreign policy-making is deeply imperfect because the answer is trying to strike a balance between recklessness on the one hand, where you say, oh, whatever, I don't give a damn if, you know, the intelligence community is telling me there's a possibility of Russian nuclear use, I'm just going to brush it off because somebody on TV said not to worry. And on the other hand, excessive caution and self-deterrence that says we're going to be so scared to support Ukraine because of World War III, we're not going to provide them the weapons and capacity they have. You have to somehow find a balance between those two. That is not necessarily the most inspiring thing in the world. And there is no mathematical formula. There's no book you can go look at to say, how do you strike the balance given these inputs? You can't plug that into an algorithm. Well, maybe in a year or two, you can plug it into an algorithm. I don't know, and everything will just be done by AI. But for the moment, you can't. So you have to think and judge and adjust as things unfold. And in the Ukraine context, what we believed and expected in February, March, April of 2022 was different from what we believed and expected in February, March, April of 2024. And so our policy adjusted over time because we realized, okay, here is an area we can take more risk. Here's an area where we continue to have concerns about the way Russia might react. And those kinds of inputs really mattered to what was a daily conversation with President Biden in the Oval Office and the Situation Room. And I don't mean daily like as a figure of speech. I mean literally daily. He would be presented with a battlefield update, a munitions update, an intelligence update. We knew the names of the villages that were being contested in eastern Ukraine, poring over them with his military and intelligence professionals, myself, the Secretary of State, others, all designed to maximize our support for Ukraine while managing the ever-present risk that this could end up tipping into a wider conflict, which we were determined to avoid. And I believe that if you look at the pattern of choices we made over time and the results that we generated, that it was a robust and effective policy that has helped save Ukraine. The main reason Ukraine was saved was the bravery and courage of the Ukrainian people themselves, but the United States played a damn important role alongside many allies and partners in helping to ensure that Russia did not achieve its strategic purpose, which was effectively to wipe Ukraine off the map.
So that is a great illustration of a central feature of the National Security Advisor's job in trying to help the whole national security team and the president navigate a complicated minefield. It's not satisfying in the sense of there's total victory of this or total this.
Right.
So one's got to be looking at this and looking at that. And where you have 4 objectives, obviously you can't maximize any one of them. You have to optimize across the 4. And again, you can look at the balance and say, well, maybe this could have been done sooner.
Yeah.
Maybe this could. And then particularly after,
You can
with the
look
benefit
back
of
and
hindsight,
say,
I can say, well, of course you could have done this sooner.
Yeah.
Of course. But I think that that's a good description.
And one thing I want to do in my book is try to help people understand when they ask the question, what were they thinking? Or more likely when they're asking, what the hell were they thinking? Is help answer that question. And you know, the whole issue of Russia's potential nuclear use is a good example of this. I think there are a lot of very confident, very smart pundits who go on TV and say, oh, that was never a serious threat, and you should never have worried about that in any serious respect. What I kind of want to lay out is you're the National Security Advisor, you're the President of the United States, you have the heads of your intelligence community come in and say there are scenarios where there's a 50-50 chance of Russia's tactical nuclear weapons use. It's not so simple to just say, come on. It's not so simple. And the whole issue of downside risk when you are a policymaker is different in terms of its measurement and its impact on decision making than downside risk is if you're looking at it from the outside, or even more importantly, if you're looking at it in hindsight. Because in hindsight, if the bad act doesn't happen, well, you can say, well, it didn't happen, so obviously they were wrong to even be worried about it. There's a fallacy there that I think it's important really for people wanting to pursue a career in public policy to recognize that these decisions are being made with imperfect information facing imperfect choices in deep conditions of uncertainty, where how you conceive of both opportunity and risk is simply different when the decision is on your shoulders than it is when you're looking at it either from the outside or with the benefit of perspective and hindsight.
Well, since that's a topic I study a lot, I think you made absolutely the right decisions on that set of risks. And the idea that you're in a situation where a director of CIA who has been, with his whole CIA team, brilliant in interpreting what Putin's about to do right from before the invasion and throughout, comes and says, well, there's about a 50-50 chance of this. I have had this debate with many of the local pundits, and I say, you go to the airport to Logan, and there's a plane, and it says this plane will go sooner, and you're going to be only half price, and there's just a 50-50 chance it might crash. I don't think you would get many people on that airplane, so I think you got a solid bet. Jake, one of the things you do best is, I think because you were a debater in another stage of life, is try to give a fair account on the one hand and then on the other and go back and forth. So as you look at at Gaza, which I know you've spent a lot of time worrying about on both sides, tell us how you see on the one hand and on the other, or it's not even one and the other.
Yeah.
It's probably 20 different hands. Yeah.
Yeah, no, you look at the ongoing, as we speak, ongoing crisis in Gaza, and it is just an unfathomable tragedy. It was born of tragedy, the tragedy of the worst massacre of the Jewish people since the Holocaust, and then the tragedy of a war that unfolded where the Palestinian people went through hell and are still going through hell. And too many Palestinian civilians died. There was not enough life-saving material sent in fast enough. And that's all, and if I were somebody from the outside looking at all that, I'd say, why can't the United States of America do more to alter that outcome? I think it's a totally reasonable question. And I don't resist that question. I ask it myself day in, day out. Was there more we could have done? I will keep asking myself that, because in the face of suffering and pain, if you don't ask that, you're not human. The challenge is that most of the time people reach the conclusion, well, what you should have done is cut off weapons to Israel, and that would have taught him a lesson, and then, this all would have ended somehow. Leave aside whether that practically would have resulted in a significant change from where we are today. Another thing we had to contend with sitting in the room was Israel was not just fighting Hamas in Gaza. It was under attack from Hezbollah in Lebanon, from the Houthis in Yemen, from the militias in Syria, the militias in Iraq, and from Iran itself. So it is a not uncomplicated proposition for the President of the United States to say, you know what we're going to do? We're going to stop giving Israel weapons in the midst of all of that. I'm not saying that to justify or argue for, advocate for the outcome. I'm saying it to just try to explain, sitting in the room, that's the kind of thing that we had to contend with. And then the other thing, which goes to the whole, it's a deeply unsatisfying, hard role, is I do believe we made a considerable difference in the amount of humanitarian assistance that got into Gaza, and I do believe it saved a lot of lives and averted a famine that was long predicted and that we staved off because every day we were working this issue very hard. Was it enough? No, it was not enough. But look at where we are today. Weeks where there has been an absolute siege of Gaza. No food, no medicine, nothing getting in. That's the difference between an American policy that pushes and gets stuff through and one that doesn't. So that's unsatisfying, and if I were sitting in the audience right now, I'd say I'm not satisfied with that, and I'm not asking you to be satisfied with it, but that's just the reality of what we're contending with.
Okay, so I'm going to do one more question, and then there's an opportunity for questions from the audience. There's 2 microphones on the ground floor, and there are 2 microphones in the loge. Just please line up, and we'll be welcome to have any of your questions. So Jake, do one more on if a chance for do-overs. So anything else that you would do over?
I don't know about do-over. There's a whole range of policies where I sort of ask, could we have done something different than what we did? Was the pacing and scope of our technology controls on China right, or should we have adjusted them in some way? Was the series of decisions we made, especially tactical decisions we made over the course of the unfolding events in the Middle East, should we have adjusted those in some way? And I'm sure that as I go through each of those individual issues, I will come up with a long list of things where I say, I sort of wish we had done that differently. But I do kind of end up with the conclusion that when we handed things off to President Trump on January 20th, 2021, I believe with conviction our alliances were stronger than we found them. Our enemies and competitors were actually weaker and more distracted than when we found them. The engines of American power were quite strong and robust, and we were not at war. And I think that as a fundamental handoff to the next team, a strategic set of assets and liabilities, I'm quite proud of what we handed off to the next team.
Good. So please introduce yourself, and the question is short and has a question mark.
Sure. Yeah, no, my name is Jad. I study chemistry at Harvard, but I enjoy politics a lot and learning about international relations. I just wanted to ask about the U.S.'s view on shaping foreign policy in the Middle East, and the potential of utilizing economic sanctions, more particularly in near the end of the administration, what happened with Syria. How do you think, what were people thinking in the Biden administration, and how did they view that change in determining what's going to happen in the future and the potential for a peace deal overall in the region?
So obviously we placed a very significant sanctions regime on Syria under the Assad regime in response to the unspeakable atrocities that he committed against his own people. It's quite tough. Congress actually passed something called the Caesar Act. When Damascus fell and you had a new governing authority in Syria, the question came, what can we do in terms of sanctions relief to try to incent good behavior and a path to a Syria that was pluralistic, respected the rights of minorities, took after the terrorists, and worked for overall stability and security. We began by immediately relaxing the sanctions with respect to humanitarian assistance and other things that could get, basic needs to the Syrian people. And then we handed off to the Trump team a plan for a roadmap that could allow for sanctions relief in response to actions that the Syrian government could take. And I think that basic model of using sanctions relief as a method of trying to generate a roadmap to a better future for Syria is the correct roadmap, and it's best done in close concert with allies, our European allies, and with partners in the region as well.
Thank you.
Gentleman in the loge.
Hi, Mr. Allison, Mr. Sullivan, thank you so much for being here with us tonight. My name is Emmanuel Edwards. I'm a sophomore here at the college from Eden Prairie, Minnesota.
Nice.
And I'm also a part of Navy ROTC, and I had a question about China. So being in Navy ROTC have just made shipbuilding very top of mind for me. And I was wondering, given China's relative shipbuilding advantage as compared to the U.S., how should and will the U.S. respond to potential tensions in Taiwan and then in the global power struggle more generally?
Well, so first, I think we need to see where our biggest advantage lies, naval advantage lies. It lies undersea with our very capable submarine fleet. We are supposed to be building 2 Virginia-class submarines a year. We're currently building 1.2 a year. I wouldn't want to be riding the .2. It's probably not, That's a problem. And it's a larger problem in our defense industrial base because for a variety of reasons, we are not generating the workforce, the supply chain, and the urgency to build. And I would start by resolving the issue with submarine and industrial base. We put a lot of time into that in our last 2 years and made huge investments to accelerate that timetable. Second, I do believe that we need to build out our surface fleet to a greater extent. But if we simply go back to the business of standard destroyers and battleships and so forth, manned battleships and destroyers, and that's kind of our only answer to China's massive expansion in shipbuilding, we're missing a huge opportunity, which is to think about autonomy, unmanned surface vessels, unmanned underwater vessels, and frankly, I think we should be doing a lot more to accelerate that. That requires not just institutional and resource shifts, it requires a cultural shift. It requires the next generation of the US Navy, you, and I thank you for your service, to say, we can imagine a Navy that doesn't look exactly like it looked 30, 50, 100 years ago, that looks like it's fit for purpose in the world today. And then the last point that I would make is that vessels are one part of the story of deterrence, but another major part of the story is quite simply how much long-range strike capacity do you have to actually put munitions on targets in a conflict? And that requires the United States to dramatically expand what I call its magazine depth. There's another defense industrial base thing that we struggled with in the context of Ukraine, but that over the course of the Biden administration, we took steps to try to increase our capacity for long-range strike. That's something I hope this administration carries forward as well.
But Jake, on that one, you and I were chatting earlier. So you've been a big fan of Ezra Klein and his book, and in his piece this weekend in the New York Times, he starts with a quote from you, and then I think half of the argument is from you, okay, about the fact that essentially we operate in a very, very slow and lethargic manner in virtually everything that we make or produce or otherwise. And that's not a new idea for you. When you were there, you struggled with it. So say some more about whether that's even feasible.
I think it's feasible, and I think,
Yeah.
well, so this goes for the defense industrial base, as I was saying, but it also goes more broadly for America's capacity to build infrastructure, to build chip fabs, to build a modern manufacturing base. And part of the answer lies in permitting, part of it lies in bureaucracy, part of it lies in just a change in expectation where we no longer expect to get things done very fast. And I think this is a cultural shift we need to make the other direction. Josh Shapiro, when the bridge fell in Pennsylvania, said, I'm not going to wait weeks and months to get it rebuilt. It got rebuilt in 12 days.
Yep.
And that's not some, magical solution. That's just a shift in expectations and mindset. And I don't believe that it is implausible that we can't make this on a national basis. There have now been enough kind of clear examples of where we simply are not building at scale or at speed that I think there will be a growing drumbeat. And the people will hold their leaders accountable to deliver faster and more effectively. And I, for one, will be out there championing that because I found in my 4 years on the job, this was a huge source of frustration.
Please, sir.
Hi, thank you both for coming. My name is Greg. I'm a senior at the college. My question is somewhat broad. Given this administration's behavior on the international stage, how can America salvage or perhaps reimagine its alliances around the world to rebuild, regain its credibility and trust?
I think it's a fantastic question. When President Biden took office in 2021, his first trip was to the G7 in the UK. And he showed up and he had a very simple message: America is back. And people welcomed us back. I imagine a president following this president trying to show up in Europe and saying, hey, America is back.
Again.
And having people say, all right, we have to acknowledge that. Now, does that mean we shouldn't go to Europe and say, hey, let's work together in our common interest because these alliances, they turn out to be pretty good things? No, of course we should. But we should do it with a degree of humility and a recognition that we are not going to necessarily recover the kind of permanent expectation that it will all be okay. We're going to have to deal against this backdrop of uncertainty and change. We can do that. But it is going to require us to be a little bit more adaptable, a little bit more flexible in terms of how we structure these alliances. And most importantly, it's going to require us to have the humility to say, we recognize that these pendulum shifts have upended your expectations of us. We're going to have to work on a different mode and model of ensuring that we cooperate together. But on the core question of should we be working closely with our European allies on the security of the Euro-Atlantic region, on aligning to deal with the China challenge, on aligning to deal with the climate crisis and to shape AI so it works for us and not against us, to me, that is an absolute no-brainer. We're just going to have to do it on a different basis than what we have gotten used to over the course of the past several decades.
But I think a good issue for your book and a good issue for students and fellows that are trying to think of a topic to think about is this: you're going to have to reimagine alliances different than the way we did in the old days, because the proposition that you were selling and Biden administration was selling to South Korea and Australia and Japan
And Europe.
Was not a proposition. We come for a while and then we go, and then we come and then we go.
Yeah.
It's got to be, I think it's actually a fascinating conceptual challenge to think about relationships that where you absolutely need each other, but there's these long interims. And I think if you look at what Merz is now saying in Germany, or what Carney, our Harvard graduate, who's likely to be the Prime Minister of Canada, is saying, they're not waiting for us to come back soon. They're thinking they're going to have to be much more responsible for their own world, and that'll be a very different world for us. So I think, again, get that chapter done. We need it. Thank you, sir. Here.
Good evening. My name is Vlad. I came here from Sumy, Ukraine, and I wanted to ask you a question related to the Russo-Ukrainian war. As you mentioned earlier, the concerns of escalation and World War III are something that you considered quite often, and I'm sure many of my compatriots have had these discussions with you, have asked you these questions already, and I'm going to do the same thing, but this time instead of kind of focusing on the vague theory, I want to ask you about a very specific decision. So in, I think, May or June of 2022, Ukraine was asking for HIMARS, and the Biden administration acquiesced, but Ukraine was also asking for the ATACMS long-range missiles, which the Biden administration declined to provide, with you specifically being quoted as basically refusing to do so due to the fears of World War III. And then 2 years later, these missiles were eventually provided. So if you could please walk us through what, for this specific decision, what was the information that made you and the Biden administration change your mind? Thank you.
So,
Maybe provide a little context, because most people don't follow it as closely as this gentleman does.
yeah, so ATACMS are a missile system with a range of 300 kilometers. So I think you said in your question that I said we didn't provide them because of fears of World War III. I don't think that I ever said that about ATACMS. The reason why we didn't provide them originally is because the Secretary of Defense and the US military told the President that the United States did not have enough of these in our inventory to meet our basic deterrence needs for the United States, and said essentially, we do not recommend or advise that these be given to another country. Over time, over the course of 2 years, we produced more. We produced enough to be able to supply Ukraine with somewhere on the several hundred ATACMS. So that was one piece of it. The second piece of it was that in those early months, in the period of April, May of 2022, the question of escalation was different than it was in 2024. I said in response to an earlier question that Graham asked, did we learn? And were we willing to do things later in the war that we weren't earlier in the war? And the answer to that question was yes, because we were prepared to take on more risk as this went along. So part of the reason specific to ATACMS had to do with the Defense Department's objection on the number we had, and part of the overall approach that we took on a range of different decisions that the President made had to do with our learning about what the level of risk tolerance was for us to be able to supply Ukraine with what it needed, while also making sure that we didn't end up in an escalatory spiral. I would just say, in closing, that we ended up providing Ukraine with a very significant number of these systems, down to the level where, again, we basically have no more to give. And the idea that they made a major difference operationally in the war has not been borne out by the evidence. So I think a lot has been put on this ATACMS decision to suggest, oh, if only you'd given ATACMS, the war would have turned out totally differently. And yet the experience of the use of ATACMS by Ukraine on the battlefield, I think, suggests that that is not, in fact, the case.
This lady?
Good evening. Thank you both so much for joining us today. My name is Allison. I'm an MPP1 here at the Kennedy School, and I'm an Air Force intelligence officer. And I wanted to ask a question returning to alliances. So right now, President Xi is embarking on this sort of goodwill tour through Southeast Asia and offering stability and economic partnership to countries including Malaysia, Vietnam, and Singapore, which is appearing to be effective so far, according to headlines. And I wanted to ask your perspective on how effective soft power measures such as that by the PRC might be, and to what extent the current political directions, both by the US and PRC, would cause the Southeast Asian nations to band together and reject American economic or political influence, in your opinion?
Look, for the countries of ASEAN, the countries of Southeast Asia, economics is the coin of the realm. And for the United States to come out with nearly 50% tariffs on Cambodia and Vietnam had to be an absolute shock to their system, especially given the fact that the US had actually encouraged companies to move from China to Vietnam to export to the United States. So this was very, I think, hard for them to look at and say, wow, we can have confidence in the course of America's economic policy going forward. Those tariffs were ultimately suspended, but by that point, in a way, the damage had been done, because the uncertainty had been injected, the sense that this could just be reimposed at some point was there and very present, and it's no surprise that the PRC looked at this and said, hey, let me go on a goodwill tour and see if we can't tell other countries we're the responsible actor, we're the ones you can count on, we're the ones you can rely upon. And I think in this respect, not just in Southeast Asia, but the world over, the decision on the tariffs has put the United States at something of a strategic disadvantage vis-a-vis China, which is ironic given that now a big part of the stated purpose of this whole tariff policy was to try to align other countries around a common approach to the PRC. This is not to say that the story is written, that the United States cannot engage these countries effectively or engage our allies effectively. It's only to say that the way in which all of this unfolded has consequences, and those consequences, I think, are things that are not lost on the decision makers in Beijing, and they have led to precisely these kinds of moves. Another move was the foreign ministers meeting between Japan, the ROK, and China, in which there was discussion of restarting a free trade agreement among the three countries with a similar kind of not so subtle message that, you know, we weren't sure, given the tariff policy, where the United States is going to be.
Please.
Hi, my name is Nadia, and I'm a senior at the college. Advisor Sullivan, in your time in office, you repeatedly refused to call what's going on in the Gaza Strip a genocide, despite your European colleagues in the United Nations claiming it so. As you can see in the posters around here, we have up to 51,000 Palestinians dead as a result. And time again, I watched the U.S. and the U.S. foreign policy system, which I once believed in, claiming that this was self-defense, claiming that Israel had a different set of standards for the Leahy Law, claiming that they were in the right on this. Can you please provide any semblance of an explanation as to how this is okay? How even under a ceasefire that you were immensely proud of, there were continued bombs dropped on Gaza, and there's a continued death count that hasn't even been near completed, with the range being 51,000 here to up to 62,000 under the rubble. Thank you.
Thank you. I said earlier tonight that too many innocent people died in this conflict, and that's not okay. And I wouldn't say it's okay, and never have. The suffering has been immense. Men, women, and children dead as a result of this terrible war in Gaza. Innocent people. I have not called it a genocide because I do not believe that it is a genocide.
Despite the United Nations calling it so.
A rapporteur at the United Nations did call it a genocide. She has her perspective. And I have not just my personal perspective, but the perspective of what our government looked at with respect to intention here. What I believe happened is that Israel conducted a campaign against a determined and murderous terrorist group that had entrenched itself among a civilian population in an area unique for two things. One, an unbelievably massive tunnel network underneath it, the likes of which we've never seen in any other conflict in the world. And two, people weren't allowed to leave. In almost every other conflict, whether it's ones we fought in, Mosul, Fallujah, other places where we've gone in tough, dense urban environment, the civilian population could go, and they couldn't go here. So 2 million people trapped in an area with Hamas operating under every manner of civilian infrastructure. And I do believe that Israel conducted itself, and President Biden said this, and I said this, in ways that were excessive in the civilian harm that they caused, and we worked hard both publicly and privately to try to reduce that civilian harm, up to and including stopping the provision of 2,000-pound bombs because of their unique harm on civilians measured against the military benefit. But I have not said this was a genocide because I do not believe that it meets the definition of a genocide. I think Israel was trying to defeat a terrorist group and in doing so acted excessively, and I think that is quite different from calling it a genocide. I respect the passions of people who hold alternative perspectives on this, but from my perspective, Israel faced an unbelievable burden in prosecuting this war that did not lessen their responsibility to do so in a way that minimized civilian harm. And we spent a hell of a lot of time working this issue. I did personally. I believe we did make a difference, not enough of a difference, but a difference. And you can see the way in which they are operating now, and it is even more excessive than it was before. But I think in your question you said, how is this okay? It's not okay. None of this is okay. What happened on October 7th is not okay, and what's happened since is not okay. It is just a terrible, god-awful tragedy. And I will continue to ask the question of whether there was something we could have or should have done differently. I'm never going to answer that question, oh no, there wasn't. I will continue to look to see and reflect and what I can learn as we go forward. But I will also hold to my convictions in terms of what I call it and don't call it, because that's my honest look at this situation, this terrible, tragic situation, which continues to this day with no apparent end in sight.
Thank you for the thoughtful question and the thoughtful answer. I think we're almost over time, but can we do a couple of more questions? Okay. This gentleman here, please.
Thank you so much for being here. I'm Varun Gupta. I'm a student at the Kennedy School and a dual degree student at MIT's Business School. One question I had, a lot of the rhetoric right now around our European allies and their response to Ukraine has been that they weren't, they didn't bring the strength and resolve that we were potentially expecting of them, and that's, the reason we're seeing a lot of these shifts in the foreign policy of this administration. So I'd love to get your thoughts on how did the administration react to our European allies' response to the invasion of Ukraine, and what does that mean for a potential future conflict with China or, general deterrence with China? How did the administration perceive the European response, and what does that mean for the future?
I mean, look, just on the basic facts, Europe contributed as much to the defense of Ukraine as the United States did in terms of dollars allocated. Now, the U.S. has certain capabilities that cannot be replicated by anybody else, including the intelligence backbone for the support of Ukraine in this war. But Europe stepped up. They drew down their stocks. They supplied resources for Ukraine's economy. They froze Russian assets and dedicated portions of those frozen Russian assets to Ukraine for Ukraine's use. And at a political level, they took hard decisions on, for example, reducing their reliance on Russian gas, which had economic effects across Europe that they had to bear, and that we tried to help step up and help them bear by sending liquefied natural gas from the United States. But I think if there's ever been an example of effective burden sharing in a coalition and an alliance, is the way in which the United States and Europe, alongside some Asian allies as well, chief among them Japan, stepped up in a big way. And so I think this argument that somehow Europe wasn't pulling its weight, wasn't doing its fair share, it's just belied by the actual evidence over the course of the past 2 years. Now, I very much agree that the mark of a healthy alliance is burden sharing. When we took office, 9 members of NATO were at the 2% threshold, 2% of GDP spent on defense. When President Biden left office, 23 allies were at 2%, and the remaining allies were all on track to get there. So it's one thing to talk a lot about burden sharing. It's another thing to do the hard, respectful work of going with your allies one by one and actually delivering and getting it done. And I think we did a good job of that. And I think we also can now see, to the point Graham was making earlier, European countries getting a kind of form of shock therapy that I think is disturbing. Europeans should be spending more on defense, but they shouldn't be spending more on defense because they can't count on the United States. They should be spending more on defense because we're all in it together. And I think that's the major issue that we contend with here right now.
So you get the last question.
Thank you, Professor Allison. My name's Kendall. I'm a third year studying history at the college. We often heard perhaps a paradigm from the Biden administration about the U.S. relationship with China, which was cooperate where we can, compete where we must, and in the process, the former two, don't let the bottom fall out. I think what we heard less articulated was what an acceptable, feasible, even desirable end state to U.S.-China relations might be. And so now, not as the sitting national security advisor, I was curious if you could articulate your thoughts on that.
I'm going to give you, I think, an answer that will disappoint you, and I swear it's not an evasion. It's what I actually genuinely believe. I do not believe there is an end state to U.S.-China relations. I believe there is a steady state. And that steady state is a steady state of competition where we also live alongside one another as major powers in the world. I do not envision a world in which China goes away or the U.S. goes away. I think the United States can continue to sustain advantages diplomatically, militarily, economically, technologically. China will keep competing to try to erode those advantages and surpass the US. And no matter what happens in that competition, we're both going to be there in the world as countries. So there's not an end state that just resolves all of this. There's rather a steady state of managed competition where we should be investing in the sources of our strength, protecting ourselves from harms, keeping lines of communication open, and working to find areas where we can cooperate to produce good outcomes. And, you know, I recognize that it'd be better for me to sit up here and say something like Kennan said in his X article. The Soviet Union has within it the seeds of its own destruction. You'll have containment. Ultimately, it will collapse, and that will be the end of it. I think we're not dealing with a circumstance like this strategically when it comes to the US-China relationship. And recognizing that, I think, is critical to the effective stewardship of this relationship over time. There are people in Washington who would say, Jake, you're wrong. The end state is we win, they lose, we crush them. I do not think that those voices have an accurate read of either how to balance U.S. interests in this regard or what is a plausible outcome that serves us all. And so I come to the answer, it's not an end state, it's a steady state.
For an interesting account of the alternative view that we question, another Harvard graduate, Tom Cotton, who's a senator, has written recently a book on 7, words or lines that you can't, that you're not allowed to say. You might not be surprised that I don't find it persuasive, but in any case, there is an alternative point of view. And another version of this picture that Jake and I have talked about before, if you try to think about the Olympics, this may be like a long-term geopolitical Olympics. And the Olympic line now is, because you and I are running against each other, faster, higher, stronger, then they put in this tagline, together. So is it conceivable you could have a serious competition and also a recognition that we have to find some way to live together? Well, there's another president, if we go back to John Kennedy and look at his American University speech, he says even in the relationship with the evil empire, we're not going to be able to resolve our differences now, but, quote, we can build a world safe for diversity. And I think because that was actually done in the Cold War, we're here. So I would say, what a fantastic thing for the Kennedy School and for Harvard to have Jake Sullivan here as the first Kissinger professor. We're going to have many chances to see him, but for today, let's say thank you very much. Thank you.